Okay, so pleasant good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the SnF2 lab. We'll be looking at the digestive system. So is the digestive system important? Why is the digestive system important? What does it do for us? One word. What does the digestive system do for us? If we had to sum it up in one word, what word would you use?
Down?
Huh?
Would it be breakdown?
Breakdown, I like that one. That's a hyphenated word, so you'll get away with it being one. So it breaks down as it relates to food. Anything else? So it breaks down the food. And what do you do with that food? One word. Yeah, provide nutrients. Yeah, nutrients. I like that word as well. Yeah, and in chat, yeah, Shaloma said the same thing. Nutrients. Absorption, right? So nutrients absorption, all relating to energy. Break down food. When you break down the food, you get the nutrients. They're absorbed. When it absorbed, the nutrients are absorbed. You run them through the hepatic portal system, right? That goes to the liver. The liver check out the blood, and see any nutrients. If it has anything toxic, it will take it out initially and then send it on its way, right? And then it goes into the general circulation, where it then goes to the different cells, gets into the cells. In the cells in the cytoplasm, it's broken down, where it generates ATP, right? So very importantly, in terms of the function of the digestive system. So if you were to look at it, and have you all looked at this in lecture just yet?
Not yet, sir.
Not yet. Okay, so you're a little ahead of the curve. So let's go. So the digestive tract, it goes from mouth to anus. It goes all the way down. That's a GI tract. And when you think about the GI tract, it's broken up into, well, they have the part before the stomach. If you were to look at a diagram, right, you have this part before the stomach, then you have the part after the stomach, which is really the small and large intestines. In terms of length, how long is the small intestine? Approximately how long? In terms of feet and inches, even though we're supposed to be metricated, but I would allow it. About how long is the small intestine, approximately? If you were using the height of a woman as a guide, average height of a woman, how long is the small intestine? Is it A, one times the length of a 5'4" woman, B, 4 times as long, C, 8 times as long, or D, none of the above? So 1, 4, or 8 times as long as 5'4". What do you think, the small intestine? 1, 4, 8?
4, was it?
So is it 4? Very good. 4 times as long. Thank you, Shaloma. Yeah, it's 4 times as long. That's right. So it's approximately 22 feet long, the small intestine. Now, you don't think about it like that, yeah? You think about, well, it's small, so it had to be chunky. No, ironically, the small intestine is actually longer than the large intestine. Funny, yeah? The small is longer than the large. So the large now, let's get on to that. How long do you think is the large intestine? Using those same parameters.
6 feet.
Well, 6, yeah, that's on the long side, but about 5'5". So 6 feet is fine. So in terms of when you're approximating the height, always remember this much. The average height for a woman is about what, 5'4", 5'5". So just remember that the large intestine is as long as the average height of a woman, and the small intestine is about 4 women. So think about one woman, think about a circus, and there are 3 women balanced on top of her. 1, 2, 3. So the total length of all 4 of them, that represents the small intestine. Pretty long, huh? Why do you think the small intestine is so long? For one word. Why is it so long? Because it related to its function. What does it do, the small intestine? What's the major function? It begins with A, ends in B, and rhymes with absorb.
Absorb?
Yeah, very good, very good. Yeah. So remember, so you have the food comes down the esophagus, goes to the stomach, where it mixes with HCl, so it's broken down, blah, 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 and then it goes through the small intestine. This is where most of the absorption occurs. So that's why it's so long. So that is the major reason why it's so long. Okay, yeah, you're quite right there, Shaloma, absorb. Teola, you're not hearing. And everybody else hearing? If you're hearing, put up your hand in the chat. Let me just see. Let's raise your hand in the chat. If you're seeing, okay, I see Avril hearing me. Akila, okay, everybody hearing me. Okay, all right, somebody mentioned that I wasn't hearing. Teola, okay, look, a suggestion was made there, Teola, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, go out and come back in, see if that works. Sometimes it happens. All right, so the reason why the the small intestine is so long, about 4 humans long, for women, average height of a woman, in terms of its length, is because it has to do all the absorption. Then it comes to the large intestine. What is mainly absorbed in the large intestine? One thing particularly, yeah, what is it? Malika, you want to answer the question, or that was from the last set of things we were talking about? What's the main thing absorbed in the large intestine?
No, sir. That was from
the last thing. Okay, no problem. But if you had to make a guess, I'll give you a hint. H2O.
Water.
Oh, yeah, yeah. So water is the main thing that is absorbed in the large intestine. And that's where in the large intestine, you have bacteria living there. And they help in the process of that absorption of water. All right, so they live on the inside. You do have, and you would hear it, of course, whenever you hear Omega XL. I am not a salesperson, nor do I represent any rivaling firm to Omega XL. That's just a disclaimer I'm stating, right? But when you hear, you might hear the whole term being used, and it's a hotspot now in terms of medicine and biology, the gut microbiome. I don't know if you ever heard the term before, but it refers to all the gut that lives in all the bacteria that lives in your gut. And they're very important in terms of aiding in digestion, and conversely, in the large intestine, they aid in water absorption. So what would happen, do you think, if remember, the major function of the large intestine is to absorb water. If those bacteria are not adequately assisting the gut, the large intestine doing its function, how do you think your stools would look? Would it look A, watery, or B, solid? Which one do you think?
Solid.
All right. If the bacteria are not doing their job, how do you think it would look? If they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, what do you think it would look?
Watery.
Yeah, it would look watery because remember, the major function of the large intestine is to do what? Absorb water. So therefore, if they're not helping the gut, large intestine do its job, the water will actually pass out through the stools. So you'll have watery stools. So that is how one of the things, if your gut bacteria or your microbiome is affected, one of the things is you have watery stools. But healthy stools is nice, solid stools. You know, the type that float? When you drop it, ploop, and you see it floating like a boat, that's the best type, right? To have. That means everything, your fiber is in order, and you don't have too much oil. Sometimes if your diet is rich in oil, or if you have some issues with your gallbladder, right? Your gallbladder, which is situated here, and that secretes bile, and bile emulsifies the fat. Emulsify is a nice big word. What does it mean? If we were to break it down, what would you say emulsify means? All right, I'll give you a hint. When you're looking at the sink after you cook, let's say pilau, and you put plenty guldenry and coconut milk and oil on top of that, and you're done, finished. So you're now looking to wash the pot in the sink, but you have to leave it to soak. So you leave it to soak, and what do you see floating on top of the water?
Oil.
Oil, yeah. So to get rid of the oil, what do? You take up your bottle of squeezy and you squeeze it in. And what happens to the oil? When you put squeezy in the water, what happens to the oil? All right, oil, yeah, Shaloma, oil.
I break it down.
Yeah, it would break down. You know, you see it like sort of make little circles and pull away from each other. So initially it's like this big blob and begins to break it up. And that's what bile does. When I say it emulsifies fat, it's just a nice thing. It breaks it up into smaller parts. And why do you want to break up that oil into smaller parts? Because in and of itself, if it's too long, now fat is a large chain molecule in terms of its size, its molecular mass, it's large. So if it aggregates, it's very big. And if it does get through, remember, it's absorbed in the small intestine. It would get into your blood. And if it does get into your blood, all of these long chain molecules, they could kind of aggregate and form clogs. And if left continuously, it could lead to plaque development. So the other thing as well, because they do form these long chains and they could aggregate and form these, you know, these little bundles, as it will, of molecules traveling in the bloodstream, you find that when they reach capillaries, now capillaries are exceedingly small. When they reach the capillaries, they have a problem. They can't fit and they stick. So what does the body do as it relates to fats? Because fats is a problem, right? So yes, it's broken up with bile secreted from the gallbladder. It's broken up. So then remember, it's absorbed all around your gut. You do have blood vessels, so they absorb the nutrients. As I mentioned, it goes to the hepatic portal system. I mean, the blood goes through the liver. Now it is circulating. It has the nutrients, but so they have the fats in it. But the fats is a problem because as it gets to the capillaries, right, it could stick. So what is the body has developed a way to alternate route for fats. It wouldn't necessarily shuttle them through capillaries, but it shuttles them through another system. What system does it shuttle fats to? Yeah, it breaks it down. That's right, in terms of the, looking at your...
Is it the lymphatic system?
Correct is right, yeah. So the lymphatics, is a nice way to remember. The lymphatics are larger than the capillaries in terms of the diameter. So your body, the machine, it is so efficient. What it does is that it shuttles the food, fats in particular, through the lacteals, which are part of the lymphatic system. All right, so always remember that in terms of the breakdown of, the passage of fats. Yes, some will pass through the blood system, the capillaries, but the majority are shuttled through the lacteals. And the reason why they're sent through the lacteals, which are part of the lymphatic, is because the lymphatics are bigger. So they're able to accommodate all those fats that pass through. Yeah? All right, good. So here we're looking at the gut, and it's really nice to see how everything is packed away very nicely. Here we have the pancreas. Pancreas has dual function. It secretes hormones as well. It does have a digestive function as well. Which hormone does the pancreas secrete? Something that is useful in terms of relating to sugar. Pancreas secretes insulin. Yeah, very good. Insulin. Right. So what insulin does, insulin is like a master key that opens when you eat a meal and the sugars are circulating in your blood in particular. It's like a master key that opens a particular channel in the cells that allows sugars to go into the cell. And that is how your sugar level drops from the blood. So that's why if you don't have insulin, what happens to the sugar? It remains in the blood. And if it remains in the blood, is that a problem? Yeah, it's a problem, because if left unchecked, the sugar then begins to destroy the endothelial layers of the blood vessels. And that could lead, of course, to poor circulation, which is what usually occurs when persons are diabetic, type 2 in particular, well, both type 2 and type 1. All right? So always remember that much. Insulin, pancreas, that's a hormone that is secreted, very important, which allows sugars to be absorbed into the different cells from the blood after a meal. Okay, hi Sam. All right. So when we take in food, how does it go? We have teeth, chew it up, and then the tongue, it pushes the bolus into the back of the throat. The salivary glands here, right? This is the parotid and the sublingual underneath the tongue. Submaxillary is a little higher. It goes down the esophagus, which is like a pipe. It goes down to the stomach. From the stomach, then it enters the small intestine. Then from the small intestine, it goes through the large intestine and then goes to ultimately to the anus, where the waste product, that which we cannot digest or that which is not used, is then given off as stools or fecal matter. So stages of digestion: we take in the food, we secrete fluids, which should break it down, we digest it. You have two types of digestion: mechanical, that involves the use of the teeth, and then you have chemical, in which you have secretions from organs or tissues which are associated with the GI tract, and that causes the cleaving of bonds, and then you could break down the different substances. For proteins, for instance, you have proteinases, which is a class of enzymes which could accelerate the breakdown of proteins. When we think about proteins, what are the components of proteins? The AA, component of protein, AA.
Amino acids.
Amino acids, correct, is right. So amino acids, those are the components that make up proteins. So therefore, if you cleave the bonds between the amino acids, well, you can break down the protein in that way. Chemically, chemical digestion. Of course, mechanically, using your teeth, you could bite and tear, you get a piece of KFC and you rip it apart, yum, 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 etc. Contractions of the GI tract, that moves the food along. And as we mentioned, absorption occurs in terms of the uptake into the blood or the lymphatic, as we mentioned. This is in the case of fats. And then defecation, in which you pass the undigested food, bacteria, and other things through the anus. So this just highlights the flow of the food from the mouth, the pharynx, which is the area, you have the oropharynx, nasopharynx, all right? So and the laryngopharynx, which is the lower part, just superior to the larynx. So it goes through the pharynx to the esophagus. Why does it not go down to your trachea? Why does food, so it's not shown here, right? But you do have the trachea, which goes down to your lungs. Why does food not go down to your lungs? One word. What's the policeman of things going down your throat? And when I say policeman, that's gender neutral term. So what's the policeman? It's a cartilaginous flap that directs things either to the esophagus or to the trachea. What's that flap? What's that flap? It begins with E, ends in S.
Esophagus.
Esophagus, I like how you're thinking, right? So the esophagus is one of the passageways and the other one is the trachea. But there's a flap that you know, like a policeman. So it's either, oh, what you is? You use food? Okay, you go down the epiglottis. What you are? Whoops, you are just air? All right, you're going down the trachea. So what's the policeman called? It has a name for that policeman who's directing things to either go to the trachea or through the esophagus, as your colleague quite just rightly mentioned. And it rhymes with epiglottis.
Epiglottis.
There you go.
Epiglottis.
There you go. There you go. Very good. The epiglottis is a flap, right? And it directs things either through. So when the epiglottis covers, so think about it, it could cover either the trachea or the esophagus. So if you're eating, it covers the trachea. So therefore, the food that comes down, and it comes down, it goes down the esophagus. And if it is you're speaking, well, the flap covers the esophagus so that air could go up and down your trachea. Right. What do you think would happen if, you know, there's a muscle that controls it? The epiglottis, right? It runs, it doesn't run this way, it runs this way under the tongue. So there's a muscle here that comes out, controls that flap. What do you think if something goes wrong with that muscle? What would happen to the epiglottis? That muscle, every muscle to the epiglottis is affected. What do you think will happen? Very simply, where food, as it relates to food, is it possible
Food might go down.
to your lungs? Is that a problem? Yeah, we looked at that in respiration. That's a big problem. Why is it a big problem for food to go down into your lungs? One word, it begins with I.
Infection.
Infection. Thank you very much. Yeah. Infection. And that's a very big problem. In fact, in the medical field to which we all subscribe to, that's a very bad word. When you hear infection, oh Lord, murder, right? It's very, that's one thing you really don't want happening. So that's why it's always, and in cases like that, what do they have to do? Persons who have issues with their epiglottis, literally what they have to do, they actually have to make an incision. I think somebody told me it's called a pug, an incision directly into their stomach. Anybody familiar with the term pug? In terms of making, so where they put the food directly into the stomach. So it doesn't go
peg
down.
feet, sir.
It's peg. I was saying
Yeah.
pug. Sorry, my bad. Yes, a peg. So they put in nutrients directly into the stomach, so it doesn't go through the oral cavity at all. Okay, very good. Let's go forward. So the coverings of the GI tract, you have your peritoneum, and these are the different divisions of the peritoneum as it relates to those. The GI tract itself has these layers, and we look at it in a little more detail. The mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and serosa. Let's have a look at them. If we were to look at the here it is. So this is just showing the different layers, the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis externa, which is the muscular layer associated with the GI tract. And here you have, of course, the serosa being the most external of the layers. Right? You have the areolar connective tissue and the visceral peritoneum. So this peritoneum, this is what is around the gut itself, right? It surrounds it. And then of course you do have the blood vessels that take the nutrients away. So very important, as shown here. When you do get down to the region of the small intestine, you have a continuation where the blood vessels actually take the nutrients away. All right, so this is just showing those divisions. So the mucosa, do take note, mucosa as the innermost. Then you have the submucosa shown here, which the submucosa has the glands associated with them, and they secrete into this lumen here. So now we come to the functions of these different things. Let's talk about the mouth. So food is only in the mouth for a very short time. As with something we could all relate to, it doesn't spend a whole lot of time in there. When it gets into the mouth, digestion begins with the chewing, of course. The teeth, it breaks it down, and then you have secretion of salivary amylase or saliva from your salivary glands. Sometimes, of course, we could have secretion of saliva without food being in our mouth. For me, whenever I smell cuchilla does it for me. I don't know if you can identify with that. When you smell certain things and you actually feel, you could feel the secretion of saliva from your mouth. I don't know if that happens with anybody else. And, and you could feel like, you're feeling your saliva actually collecting. Doesn't happen with anybody else, no? But me in particular.
With chow, sir.
With chow, yeah. When you're making the chow, you just smell it. You smell like the pepper or something like that, or sometimes the thyme. The thyme as well for me does it with chow. And you start secretion. Now, why are your salivary glands beginning to secrete? Because there's no food in your mouth. So why are they secreting saliva then? Why do you think so? Because they are. Let me put it like this, it's Christmas time, and what you do, you go to Hilo or Massey stores, as it's known now, you buy food and you have food in your house, things that you don't normally buy, you have it in the cupboard and the fridge and so on. Why do you do that? Because what? It was Christmas time. You want that thing in your house. Why so? Because you do what? One word I'm looking for. It begins with E. It has an X in it. You're something people to come.
Excited.
You're excited that people come in. Yes. Let me
Expecting.
You're excited because you're expecting people to come. So you were both correct, right? Both excited and expected have the EX in it. So you're expecting people to come. So could you relay that now to the mouth and the secretion of saliva when you smell like cuchilla? What do you think is happening there? The mouth is something, food to come.
It's expecting the food.
Yeah, it's expecting the food to come. So when you smell it, it's expecting in expectation. So it's not even waiting for the food to reach in your mouth. It starts already. It smells the cuchilla, it smells the chow, and it's like, let me get ready. And therefore it starts to secrete, the saliva, which has salivary amylase, right? It's the first thing breaks down carbohydrates. All right, so this is just showing the process by which food, when you do get food in your mouth, how it does get down. It shows then that the nasopharynx, of course, that closes off. Your uvula goes up and it blocks it. Uvula, that little thing to the back of your throat, right? That is very important. It's shown here, right? So this is your uvula here. It goes up and it blocks the nasopharynx. You know that thing that you see at the back of your throat that hangs down? That's really extension of your soft palate, which is your uvula. So it blocks the nasopharynx. So you swallow and it goes down. Here it is, we're seeing the trachea. This is the epiglottis. It covers the trachea, so food doesn't get in. Instead, it goes down the esophagus, and then it enters. Here you have the lower esophageal sphincter, which is a muscle. This opens up, it allows it to go in. Once it goes in, this closes off, right? And that's how food moves from the mouth down to the stomach. Right, so the tongue, of course, it not only has taste buds in it, but it's a muscle, it's muscular, and it helps the movement of food to the back of the throat or to the oropharynx, and then peristaltic movements move it down the esophagus and into the stomach itself. Of course, in getting it down there, we have different things that break it. Expecting, yes, I now see it, you have it there, Shaloma, thank you. So the teeth, right? We all have teeth, and you have the different types of teeth, the incisors, the cuspids, the bicuspids, and the molars, and they each have different functions. The incisors, these are sharp, mainly for cutting. The cuspids, they're sharp for piercing and tearing as well. You have the bicuspids, and most importantly, you have the molars to the back for grinding and crushing. I think we could identify. So which ones do you think, if you're eating chana, fried chana in a bottle with some salt, garlic, and the ones that they sell, Patsy, I think Patsy's chana is the one, split chana. Oh no, that not split chana, that one is yeah, that one is split chana, split pea, yeah, split peas, whichever one. But it's chana, split chana, all right. So which ones, what type of teeth would you use for, in particular, if you're crushing chana? I kind of give you the answer there. Which ones would you use? Right, your molar, when you have chana, you're going to your back and you're crunching it, crunch, 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 right? And that's where your molars come in. But the incisors, those are the ones to the front, and those are the ones which are used for tearing. So here we see them, the premolars, there's the cuspids here, right? And these are your molars all the way to the back itself. The incisors, those are the ones which are very important for tearing, right? So these are your incisors here. So the parts of the teeth, very important. Enamel, hardest known substance in your body, right? Enamel, that could be a little trivia question. Hardest known substance is enamel. And underneath, of course, you have dentin, you have pulp, and so on. Recently, we've noticed, and with a bit of sadness, how they are finding the remains of persons who have met an untimely death at different places in and around Trinidad. When they do find them, oftentimes, they had various stages of decomposition, which sometimes makes the identification of the remains as it relates to gender very difficult, right? Because what you have to remember in terms of How do you identify if it's male or female? Yes, there are certain characteristics in terms of breast, organs, which are the most visible of the lot. But again, if decomposition has occurred, these could, it's very difficult to actually see these things. Yes, I hear what you're saying. The flaring of the lips as related to, the hips as it relates to the skeleton as another way you can identify it. Yes, but there are some women who don't have very much flaring to the pelvic region as it relates to hips. So sometimes that is not too conclusive. What other method could they use then to identify the remains, particularly decomposed remains, to see first of all if it's male or female? Well, has to do with a tooth. Anybody wants to make a guess as how you could use a tooth to determine the gender of a person, of decomposed remains?
Dental records.
Okay. Oh, I didn't think of that one, but you're quite right there, Lena. So if you are fortunate, you could use the dental records. That is quite true. But let's say we don't. I'm being devil's advocate. If we don't have dental records, how could we identify? Now we're just looking at gender to see if it's male or female, right? So we don't have the luxury of, let's say, dental record, but that would make total sense there, Alina. How else could we use the teeth to actually tell if it's male or female? Let's say these remains were about 6 months old, out in the sun. So it's bleached, the tissue, most of the tissue is gone. All right, let me see if I could point you in you know it, but let me point you in the direction. When you look at our cells, how many pairs of chromosomes do we have? Michael Jordan's number or LeBron James' number?
26.
23.
23.
Oh, sorry, 20.
23. It's all good. You were in the ballpark, and you must be a positive for that. At least you didn't say 465,311. Then that would have been off, but you were very close. So we have 23 pairs, 22 autosomes, and 1 pair of sex chromosomes. So the thing is, if we could get a good tissue sample, right? If we could get a very good tissue sample, we could actually analyze those chromosomes and tell if it's male or female. Because how do we know that? Males are XX or XY as it relates to chromosomes. Which one is male, which one is female?
XY is male.
XY is male and XX is female. Going back to your SnF 1 days. And how I always remember it is because woman is boss, not so? So when you think about it, the XX chromosomes are long. The X chromosome is longer than the Y. So in truth and in fact, genetically, women have more genetic information per cell than males. So you'll take a bow on that woman, you'll have more genetic information. But please do not use that as a leverage tool when arguing with your significant other. You're telling him, oh, you know why you're stupid? You know why you're stupid? It's because of you XY. You're missing a piece of chromosome. You're missing. Please don't use that as a leverage tool. It usually does not come out very well. Let's go forward. XY, 23rd pair of chromosomes. Those are, you have 22 autosomes, and then you have the 23rd pair being the sex chromosomes, XY. So what could you do? You could identify it from the tooth. We mentioned that there's enamel around the tooth, right? Enamel. And what the enamel does, it preserves all of the tissue that is inside. It preserves it for a very long time. So what do? Once they get teeth present, in the remains, what they could do then is drill. They drill through the enamel, and usually the pulp is intact. So from that pulp, they could then find tissue. Well, in the tissue made up of cells. From those cells, right, they could do an analysis of the chromosomes, have a look at those pairs, and then they could actually analyze, and see then if the person is male or female. All right, so do remember that. That's what teeth drilling. That's another way that you could use to identify remains, especially when you have a lot of physical decomposition of the tissues. Yeah, so this is a virtual little vault that keeps the tissue in the, intact. All right, so we went to the teeth. We mentioned how the food passages from the mouth down to the stomach. Now let's talk about some of those salivary glands that are in and of themselves present in the mouth. We have the parotid, right? The parotid, this is the largest of the lot and is located anteriorly and inferiorly to the ear. Let's see if we could see it here. So here we have the parotid, largest of the lot, the submandibular, and then you have the sublingual. Sublingual because it's under the tongue, submandibular because this is location. This is the mandible, because the upper part of your jaw is your maxilla. So this is the lower part of the mandible. It's called the submandibular gland. Beneath the tongue, sublingual. Of course, sub meaning below. Could you think of a device that uses the word sub as it relates to the sea to allow you to go under the sea? What is that one called?
Submarine.
A submarine, yeah. So the word sub means under, and so that's a nice way to remember. It's sublingual, under tongue, submandibular, lower part of the mandible or the jaw. And this one is the parotid. Parotid close to the ear, right? Parotid down. And they all secrete saliva into the mouth as it relates to digestion. Submarine. Thanks, Shaloma. Right? Then you have, so from the mouth, we're going down. The next part is the esophagus. This is a long tube that is inferior to the laryngopharynx and about 10 inches long. So once you pass the laryngopharynx, it goes down, and this is the esophagus. It's non-keratinized, stratified squamous, and the function is transport. That's the only thing the esophagus does, right? There are certain, whereas a lot of the structures and tissue layers in the body, they usually have a number of functions, but there are some things in the body that just has one function. The esophagus is one of them. Transport. That's all that. Transport food. Another one is the bladder, right? What does the bladder do? Right? To borrow from the Palance, it holds urine. That's all it does. Or if you want to be more brief, you could say it holds pee. That's all it does. Full stop. Doesn't do anything else. That's the only job it has. And therefore, what type of tissue, when you hear the bladder, what type of tissue comes to mind? There's only one specific type of tissue always associated with the bladder. What tissue type is that? Transitional, yes, right? So transitional epithelium, that's one that is specifically associated with it. The stomach is J-shaped, right? And it moves around things, churns it and so on. Protein digestion starts there. And always remember, the stomach, you don't really absorb much things from the stomach, right? With the exception of water, alcohol, and drugs, right? Very little is absorbed. But the main function is to initiate this breakdown of the food. The regions of the stomach, they have specific areas, the cardia, fundus, body, and pylorus. These are the different parts of the stomach. And you'll look at them in a little more detail in your lecture. I'll just highlight them. The fundus is the top part. Cardia, shown here. This is the main body. The pylorus, and then, of course, there's the pyloric sphincter. So you have two. You have the esophageal sphincter up here and the pyloric sphincter. What would happen if this, the sphincter is like a ring of muscle. It closes when digestion, when you're breaking down food in here. What would happen, particularly at night, right? If you have some food going on in your stomach. Now, remember, food is acidic. You have secretion of HCl. So the acid, the chyme that is present in here, chyme just refers to the food mixing up with saliva, mixing up with the secretion of the cells, HCl present as well. What would happen if this pyloric sphincter isn't working well and it allows some of this acid chyme to go back up? That's what happens particularly at night when you're lying down. right? What would
Like
happen?
acid reflux?
Ooh,
Like acid
what you
reflux?
saying? Yes, yes, yes. You went a couple steps ahead of me. Well done, right? So it would get into your mouth, and that is known as acid reflux. You get this burning sensation in your mouth, right? Very well, very good. That's acid reflux. Of course, yes, there are certain medications to take. What could you do physically, to prevent that with acid reflux? So that means something is going on with your esophageal sphincter, right? Which is this one here. Is there anything you could do physically to help yourself out to prevent that from going up into your mouth?
You like sit up? Well,
Mhm.
I don't know.
I hear what
guess
you're saying. Prop yourself up. Quite right.
Yeah.
So either use a lot of pillows or if you have one of them fancy bed, where you could push the button and it go and it raises it, elevates. Or you could put some things under the mattress, elevate the mattress. But just keep your upper torso higher than your, let's say, from your pelvic region down. So in other words, then the food wouldn't just come out through this esophagus, giving you acid reflux. All right, very good. This is just showing the mucosa, and again, the mucosa layer, some mucosa underneath the mucosa layer is shown here. What does this remind you of when you look at it? It reminds you of anything else? When you hear, one layer with a sub-layer beneath it, what comes to mind? This was from SnF. The skin, I like how you're thinking. Well done, Avison. Yeah, the skin. I just saying Avison because I just calling it from my name there. Yeah, so the skin, and you have your dermis, and then you have the epidermis, and then you have the subcutaneous layer, right, as well with the skin itself. And it's very similar, right, in terms with the dermis and the epidermis. And then you have the submucosal layer where you do have some blood vessels running through it as well. So this is just showing the gastric pit, right, and the chief cells and the parietal cells, in which you do have the secretion of HCl. Very importantly, there's mucus which is secreted on the stomach lining, and that prevents the HCl from actually dissolving to the wall of the stomach. Sometimes you do have the very same HCl that is used to digest food that is actually could begin to digest the stomach wall, creating holes or creating large areas where some of the epithelia is damaged. When that happens, when you have, what is that called? What is that condition known as? It begins with U, where you could have damage to the stomach wall, or sometimes literally ulcers. Yeah. And H. pylori, there's a particular bacteria that is often associated with, with persons who do have ulcers. But you have to be careful in that regard. And what do you do? There are different things which has to be done as it relates to that, beyond the scope of the class itself. So I wouldn't get into the details, but you could alter your diet, and there's medication as well, which could be taken for that. In extreme cases, surgical intervention may help as well. Let's get to the liver. So we mentioned now the liver, largest organ by mass. I want to say it's heavier than the brain. So largest by mass in the body itself. It produces bile. And as you mentioned, bile breaks up fats. So which is why for persons, when you're defecating, when you go to the bathroom and you're defecating and you notice your stools, they're particularly one dark, sometimes blackish, which could indicate blood in the stools. But more so, if you see them shiny, consistently shiny, that could mean then that a lot of fat is actually coming out. And that could point to gallbladder. Something is wrong with the gallbladder in terms of releasing the bile. All right, so shiny stools consistently, it could indicate then that you're having issues with emulsifying fats. Hence the reason the fat is coming out and is actually present in the stools themselves. So the liver, it contains hepatocytes. Oftentimes when we look at the body, what do we notice about organs? Not with the heart, but with the kidneys and with your lungs. What can you say about them? What is common to both your kidneys and your lungs? Numerically. how many kidneys and lungs do you have?
No.
And why do you have two?
Backup.
Backup. Ah, you're using one word. Very good, right? So for backup, right? So you do have it, right? For backup. Thanks, Shaloma. So you do have it for backup. You have two of them for backup. Now, do you have two livers? No. But the thing with the liver is, all the livers, they contain these cells called hepatocytes. And the thing is, all of the hepatocytes do the same thing, which is absolutely incredible. So therefore, if part of the liver is damaged, it's not an issue, right? You could lose up to about 50 to 60% of your liver, and your liver will still function. It will still do its job efficiently. So the reason why is because of the fact the liver it contains only hepatocytes, and all the liver cells do the same thing, right? So that is another way when you're looking at organs in terms of backup. Some of them you have distinct organs, but some of the organs themselves, all the cells are the same. And the liver is one example of it, right? So then you have, so the liver then, the blood system, when you look at the hepatic portal vein going to the liver, it brings the hepatic portal artery, it brings it to the liver and then removed by the veins itself. So the hepatic artery and portal veins, it delivers the nutrient-rich blood, and the hepatic vein returns the blood to the inferior vena cava. So the portal vein brings it, and the hepatic vein, it returns all the blood to the inferior vena cava. It goes through, and now it goes into the systemic circulation. All right. So very important there to remember that as it relates to the liver. Let's see if we can have an image of that. This one doesn't show the circulation. We'll see the circulation coming up in the next image, right? But this is just showing the structure of it. You have the right and the left lobe of the liver itself. And then right above, superior to the liver, you have your diaphragm. When we think of the diaphragm, which organ system is usually associated with the diaphragm? It's very important. We looked at it recently. Which organ system?
Lung.
The lungs, right? So which organ system does the lungs belong to? Begins with R.
Respiratory.
Excellent. The respiratory system. Quite good. But you were quite right in saying the lungs has the major organs associated with it. Good job. All right, so you have the diaphragm here. And as your colleague just mentioned, the lungs associated with the diaphragm in terms of moving them. So it's a major muscle associated with it. So just inferior to the diaphragm, you have your liver as shown here. And as we just mentioned, right, you have a hepatic portal vein, which brings the blood, right, and the hepatic artery, which brings oxygenated blood to the liver itself. Hepatic portal vein brings it, and the hepatic vein takes it away to the inferior vena cava. So the gallbladder, what does the gallbladder do? It's a holding tank for bile. We mentioned that, right? Bile contains bile salts, and what they do, right, the bile salts is the emulsification. Just think about the oil in the sink after you wash your pilau pot, cover with oil, you throw in the squeezy, and you see, the blubber oil begins to separate. That's what bile does, right? And the reason it does is to break it up. And when it does break it up, it makes it easier to transport. And as we mentioned, even though it could transport through the capillaries, it still has some issues. So what the body does, as it relates to fats, it shuttles them through the lacteals or the lymphatic system, because the lymphatic system is a little bit bigger, right? The diameter, and when compared to capillaries. So do remember that the lymphatics, right, transport of fats via the lacteals, right? So do remember that. That's an important part of it. The pancreas, two types of glands, the exocrine and the endocrine. The endocrine, we might be familiar with this one, it secretes insulin, and the exocrine, it secretes pancreatic juice, which drains into the duodenum, and these contain digestive enzyme. Right, so this is as showing here, the pancreas. And when we think about the pancreas, we think about the islets of Langerhans, pancreatic islands. And the reason why they call it an islet, which is like a small island, because when you look at it, this is on a microscope, it looks like an island, right? In like a sea. It stains a little lighter than the surrounding tissue. That's how they could actually identify it, the pancreatic islet. So it's very much like an island inside of a sea. All right, so we spoke about the pancreas and we spoke about some of the other organs. Let's talk about some of the duct systems. So one of the major ducts is associated with the draining of bile. And when we think about it, from the liver, you have the left and right bile ducts. It goes to the common hepatic, common bile, and the hepatopancreatic ampulla. So do we need to know this in any detail? No, we don't. It's not on the syllabus, but it's just put here for you to appreciate how things circulate as it relates to the ducts in the body itself. The small intestine consists of 3 parts, DJI, right? DJI. And what is DJI? The duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. The duodenum, this is the smallest segment, the jejunum, specializes in nutrient, and the ileum, it absorbs any nutrients left in the chyme and bile salts. All right, so that is very important as it relates to those parts. So this is the large intestine and your small intestine. Do note their positioning. When food comes out of the stomach, where does it go in first? Does it go into the small intestine or the large intestine first?
Small, sir.
Yeah, it goes into the small intestine, right? Duodenum, jejunum, ileum. Then it goes into the large intestine via the ileocecal valve. It goes in, and now it gets into the large intestine. So from the stomach, empties into the small intestine, then empties into the large intestine. Now, the walls of the small intestine, they're covered with villi. It's very important to have a look at it. What do these villi or these projections, which are present in the walls of the small intestine, what do? They increase what? SA. Because of the fact it goes up and down, right? As opposed to if it was lying flat.
Surface area.
It increases surface area. Excellent. Yeah. So that's one of the reasons why it's like this. You can think about it like if you have a sheet on your bed, yeah? Of course, it's lying down on your bed is nice and flat. But when you get up in the morning, you know, all the sheets, you know, they push up in one corner, and you find then that, hey, it doesn't cover the whole bed. It's probably about half of the bed, but you still have the whole sheet there. And the reason why, because there are lots of folds, you know, everything is folded in on itself. And that's the same thing whenever you have these indentations, right? So now the surface area is increased. Surface area, very important as it relates to the small intestine, because you need to create a larger surface area as possible to increase absorption. And that's why you have it. So there's another looking at it in a little more detail in terms of the villi or these projections. Underneath the villi, you have these capillaries. So therefore, you could have from here the absorption in terms of the movement of the nutrients into the blood supply. And of course, as we just saw from here, it goes via the hepatic portal vein, it goes to the liver itself, then it goes via the portal vein, it then goes to the inferior vena cava, and then to the systemic circulation. This again is just showing those villi which are present. These are very small ones that are known as microvilli. So that's the small intestine. The large intestine consists of the cecum, that's where it receives undigested food from the ileum itself. Then you have 4 parts, the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid, so-called because of their shape. The shape of the large intestine, right? Ascending, transverse, descending, sigmoid, colon. Then you have the Tenea coli and the Hostra. Now the Tenea coli, this is the outer muscle layer. And the Hostra, these are bulges that result from the contraction. So when you do have movement in the large intestine and you have these bulges being produced, the bulges are known as Hostra, but they are brought about because of the action of the Tenea coli. The rectum, this is the straight vertical short tube that connects the colon to the anus. So that's, of course, the second to last part of the large intestine. Then, of course, you get to the anus itself. There are two sphincters, the internal and external. The internal is involuntary, but the external is voluntary. This, of course, is important in terms of quote unquote holding it in. But what is interesting this is a learned trait in terms of control of the external. There are some persons who don't have control of the external or who have lost control, and therefore they suffer from a condition which is known as, begins with I, and it involves quote unquote adult disposable diapers or adult pampers, and that is known as, the condition is known as, begins with I, when you no longer have control, either your anal sphincter or your bladder sphincter for that matter. So therefore you're termed as being incontinent. Very good, incontinent. So when you do lose control of the anal or bladder sphincters for that matter, you're then deemed to be incontinent. So that's one of the reasons I often tell persons, well, to each his own when bringing up children. I remembered when I was younger, no, I don't suffer from incontinence. I know some of you all saying, no, look, so go and tell me an incontinence story. No, fortunate not to have that condition. But when I was younger, I do recall, it was like the thing to do where parents or persons would tell, children, hey, if a child were to tell the parent, hey, I want to, let's say they're downtown or wherever they might be, tell, hey, mommy, I want to use the bathroom. And what they would reply, if it's particularly for males, they'd say, hold it in, be a man. They would equate being a man to holding in, your body waste. And I will, now that I've, come to a position of consciousness, now I could see what a great travesty and tragedy that was or is. So I always tell persons, please, if you do have, children or what have you, that's not a good idea, because later in life that could lead to incontinence, either as it relates to the bowels or your intestines or relating to your bladder. So please, don't tell your children, hold it in. Do look to find a place, where they could relieve themselves either, in some facility or otherwise. So this is just showing then the large intestine. This is the ascending, transverse, descending, and the sigmoid colon, so called because of the associated shapes and the locations of them. Here's the rectum, which of course is superior to the anus, because this is the anus, which is the end, represents the end of the GI tract. So from here, this is the ileum. Remember the duodenum, jejunum, ileum. This is the small intestine. The ileum, it empties into the cecum. The appendix. What does the appendix do? Anybody wants to hazard a guess? What does the appendix do? Do we know what it does? All right, I see there's a response there. Nothing. Okay, good answer, Shaloma. Nothing, Rayon. Okay, good answer for the most part. Just in science, which is something I learned much later on, I wasn't aware of it. Scientists never really speak in absolutes. I don't know if you, right? So as opposed to saying nothing, while that might be true, what could be, the way you could state that a little to improve on that would be to say, based on the knowledge we have currently, it does nothing, it's good to preface it, with a statement, because there are lots of things, within science, which they thought, didn't do anything, and it did turn out to be quite useful. So that's one of the things, if you ever read scientific journals and so on, you always see them, they don't speak in absolutes, this study suggests that, we're currently in not a pandemic, we're almost above that. We're almost over the hill where that is concerned, moving more to the endemic stage. You notice that none of the claims, you never hear them say, take the vaccine and it is 100% guaranteed that you will not get COVID or any of its variants, Omicron or otherwise. In a similar way, in science, it's always a good thing to hold back and say then that, based on the knowledge we have now, we don't think it does anything. They always preface it. And I was not aware of that, you know, until I actually started doing my science studies, you know, in grad school, right? Because similarly, I would say the same thing, nothing, right? But then you realize we just don't know, but we don't overtly say that, no, we don't know. Yeah, we always preface it in terms of our knowledge. So you're quite right. In terms of the knowledge we currently have, we don't think it does anything, right? But it could have a function later in life. Later on, you know, when our science gets better, we might figure it out that it does something. But as far as we know, it really does nothing. So thank them for that input, Shalom and Rayon. Okay, well done. So here we go. So this is the tinea coli, again, the muscular regions. And then, right, the haustra, these are the bulges. These bulges are shown here. These are the descending colon, sigmoid, rectum, right? And then, of course, the internal and external, we do have control over. We don't have over the internal, but we do over the external sphincter, right? So that's how we could hold in to a certain extent. When sometimes you eat something that's a little off. Anybody ever, you know, leave something in the pot? Let's say you're late for class, back in the days when you used to physically go to class, which will be returning soon, you know, in terms of that. But, you know, you leave something on the counter, and let's say you come back now in the afternoon, and it's still there, and you pick it up and you smell it, and you're saying to yourself, boy, that's smelling a little funky. You're not sure. And you go back in for a next smell. You know, I'm not sure. A rule of thumb, whenever you see you have to smell something twice, is usually a very good idea to throw it away, yeah? Usually the outcomes are not good when you smell something twice and you're still not sure. Yeah, it usually involves, in particular, using your large intestine and also going to the porcelain throne and also making promises to Jesus or whichever deity that you subscribe to. Oh, Jesus, if you take this from me, you know, I will behave myself. You know, all due respect to all religious personnel out there. But yes, you know, so always remember when you smell something and you're not sure, it's always a very good idea to throw it away, because the long-term effect usually involves, you know, your large intestine and small intestine and things coming out at the end. So always remember that. Smell it twice. Smelling twice, it not nice. That's a nice thing to remember. Okay, 2 more slides. So this is showing here the walls of the large intestine. And as we did mention, the major function is to absorb water, right? So usually once the large intestine is functioning correctly, it does, because of the fact it absorbs water, therefore our stools will come out firm. If it doesn't absorb the water, if something is wrong, the water is left in the stools and we have watery stools as a result, okay? All right, so what did we look at today? We looked at the digestive system of the human, well, in the human, and we looked at it from mouth to anus. And when we're looking at it in terms of mouth to anus, the digestive tract, we looked at it starting in the mouth, digestion, we mentioned, of course, the function of the teeth and the tongue in terms of moving that bolus to the back of the oropharynx. It then travels down the pharynx through the esophagus down to the stomach. From the stomach, you have secretions from both the stomach and some of the supporting organs. And then they move into the small intestines where nutrients are absorbed. Nutritive properties of the, when they are absorbed, they then go into the hepatic portal system, and via the hepatic portal vein, they travel to the liver, they leave the liver via the portal vein, then they go into the inferior vena cava, and then through the heart into the systemic system. Now the nutrients could be brought to the cells. If we were to think about one of the nutrients being glucose it is traveling along into the bloodstream after leaving the heart via the aorta, is traveling in the bloodstream. Now secretions from the pancreas, in particular insulin, which is stimulated as a result of food being in the stomach. Insulin now opens the channels in the cells that particularly let in sugars. when these sugars actually enter the cell, they now, of course, go into the cytoplasm where you have glycolysis occurring because of the enzymes present in the cell. The glycolytic enzymes, they break down sugars. If you look at it simply, glucose breaks it down until it gets to pyruvate. Pyruvate is then shuttled to the mitochondria where you have the completion of the breakdown of the glucose. Approximately 30 to 33 ATP generated in the mitochondria, 3 in the cytoplasmic reduction as related to glycolysis. So for one molecule of glucose, you have approximately 36 ATP being generated. And that's how food is actually broken down in the body, absorbed, and shuttled to the cell where energy in the form of ATP is actually created. Digestion involves taking the food in, breaking it down mechanically or chemically, and then it traverses in that route, which we just mentioned. Also, we mentioned as well, there are certain layers that are present in the tract, the digestive tract, and these layers are very important as it relates to absorption, and some have secretory functions when we look at some of the organs. So for instance, in the stomach, you do have secretion of HCl, and this is important in terms of breaking down some of the bonds present in the food that you do take in. We also mentioned from the mouth itself, in terms of the arrangement, you have both mechanical, chemical breakdown via the secretion of saliva, mechanical due to the dentition or the types of different teeth which we have. Either we have the incisors for tearing or molars, premolars, which involve the crushing of things. We also did mention the importance of the tooth. One of the things which stuck out is that the tooth could be drilled to obtain cells. When you're looking at persons who have been deceased for an extended period of time and where tissue for analysis is difficult to obtain. So you could get a tooth, it could be drilled, and then the pulp could be extracted, and that could be used for DNA analysis to determine the sex of the individual. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Could it be also used to track the hereditary, the genetics of the person? The answer is yes. There might be certain characteristics which could be used, in terms of DNA analysis of that pulp material, and that is how you could identify persons. So if you do get, for instance, persons or remains found, say 10, 20, 30 years, you might see these things in the States, right? How could they actually identify who the person is? And one of the things, notwithstanding, let's say the clues and all of that might have been, gone by then, but they could use DNA analysis of the tissue found in the pulp of the tooth, because of the fact that the enamel actually preserves the pulp that is found in the tooth, and that then they could do that extraction. Mention the different salivary glands and their role and the structure of the stomach, different areas of the stomach. And we also mentioned, if something does go wrong with the esophageal sphincter, how you could have regurgitation of the food, which could lead to acid reflux disease. Cure, one of the cures, notwithstanding medical intervention, but just elevating the upper torso could lead to some easing where that is concerned. We mentioned the liver, gallbladder in terms of holding for bile emulsifying fat, and this fat is then transported ideally through the lymphatic via the lacteals. Pancreas has two, both the exocrine and endocrine function. Endocrine, of course, in terms of insulin, and the exocrine, it does also secrete digestive enzymes. Small intestine, in terms of the walls, the surface area is increased dramatically because of the presence of those villi, and that is very important. The large intestine, it does have certain parts associated with it, which are associated with its structure. You have the ascending, transverse, descending, and sigmoid. The sigmoid, which is the last part, so-called because of its similarity to the Greek letter sigma, the shape of it. So that's why it's called that. And then we just concluded with mention of the anus. In terms of the two sphincters, you have the internal and external, with the external one being voluntary and the internal one being involuntary. Okay? All right. Any questions? No? All right, let me just stop there.